The night was quiet in Oakwood, a small town in the interior of North Carolina. For most of the residents, the tranquility was a blessing, but for Janet Miller, a newly arrived art teacher, the silence felt more oppressive than soothing. Janet had moved into an old house on Oakwood Street, which, despite its imperfections, had a certain nostalgic elegance. The house, dating back to the late 19th century, featured a Victorian facade with tall windows and wooden shutters, and a garden that seemed to have been neglected for decades. The move had been challenging, but Janet was excited to start a new chapter in her life. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold, had passed away shortly before Janet's move, and the house had been vacant for some time. Despite the house's history and the recent move, Janet felt confident. But soon, she would begin to question whether that confidence was misplaced. In the first few days, everything seemed normal. Janet spent her time arranging furniture, unpacking her things, and preparing the house for the start of classes. However, something began to happen. At night, just as Janet was about to sleep, she would hear noises she couldn't identify. They were subtle sounds, scratches on the walls, light footsteps in the hallway, and occasionally a faint whisper she couldn't understand. These sounds weren't enough to terrify her, but they were enough to make her question things. On the first night she heard the noises, she thought it could be the old building settling. On the second night, however, the unease began to set in. The doors creaked more than usual, and an inexplicable chill seemed to penetrate certain rooms, even when the heater was on. It was during the third week that Janet began to notice something truly odd. One of the windows on the upper floor, which overlooked an empty room, was always slightly ajar, no matter how many times she closed it. Additionally, the hallway lights seemed to flicker intermittently, even though the bulbs were in good condition. On a particularly quiet night, Janet was sitting in the living room, reviewing some lesson plans, when she heard a louder sound. It was as if someone was knocking on a door. She went to check, but there was nothing. The house was quiet, except for the faint crackling of the wood in the walls. Janet tried to ignore it, but the discomfort was beginning to become unbearable. That night, Janet decided to investigate the upper floor room. It was a space she hadn't really used yet. The door was locked when she found it, and she had to use an old key that Harold had left with her. When she opened the door, Janet felt a shiver run down her spine. The room was covered in dust, as if it hadn't been used for years. There was an old bed in the center, with a mattress that seemed to be falling apart, and a large armoire pushed against the wall. The decor was outdated, with faded wallpaper and heavy furniture that made the room seem even more somber. As she explored the room, she noticed something peculiar: a small box under the bed. The box was covered in dust and seemed to have been forgotten for a long time. Janet hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside the box was a collection of old photographs, some of unknown people and others with scattered notes, almost like diaries. There were also some letters that looked very old. The contents of the letters made Janet's heart race. They were letters from a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the house about 50 years ago. The letters spoke of a series of strange and unsettling events. Eleanor mentioned unexplained sounds, doors opening by themselves, and a feeling of being constantly watched. She also spoke of a dark-hatted man, who seemed to appear in her dreams and was always associated with a sense of terror. The last letter was incomplete, merely stating, "He is here. I don't know how much longer I can endure." Janet began to feel frightened. The descriptions in the letters seemed to match her own experiences. Determined to learn more, she went to the local library to research the house's history and Eleanor's family. She discovered that the Miller family had lived in the house for several generations, and that the house had a long history of tragedies and mysterious deaths. In the following days, Janet tried to remain calm, but the situation only worsened. The noises at night became more intense and the whispers clearer. She started seeing shadows moving at the edges of her vision and felt a constant presence, as if someone was always watching her. One night, Janet woke up with a shock as she felt a cold touch on her arm. She got up and checked the entire house but found nothing. The next morning, while reviewing the old photograph she had found in the box, she saw a photo of a woman who looked identical to her, except that the face was a little paler and the eyes a deeper shade. The caption on the back of the photo read, "Eleanor, the new resident." Janet's paranoia increased, and, determined to solve the mystery, she sought the help of a paranormal expert. The expert conducted an investigation in the house and confirmed that there was a disturbing energy in the front room. He found evidence of paranormal activity, such as unexplained temperature changes and an increase in electromagnetic activity. After hearing the expert's findings, Janet decided to spend the last night in the house awake, sitting in the upper floor room. She wanted to confront whatever was there. As the night progressed, the atmosphere became heavier and more oppressive. The cold in the room was intense, and the silence was unsettling. Suddenly, the armoire began to move on its own, and a dark shadow emerged from it, taking the form of a man with a dark hat. Janet felt a deep panic, and as the shadow approached, she closed her eyes and began to pray. Suddenly, the sound of a deafening scream filled the room and the shadow vanished. When she opened her eyes again, the armoire was still and the room was quiet. The next day, Janet decided to leave the house. Although there was no scientific explanation for the events, the experience had been enough to convince her that something supernatural was present. She moved to a new place, far from Oakwood Street, and never returned to the house. Janet never discovered what truly caused the disturbing events in the house, but the story she took with her was a terrifying reminder that some places carry more than just old stories. And for those who venture into the shadows of the past, there is always a chance that the past is still waiting to tell a new story.